My name is Deeohn Ferris. I'm president of the Institute for Sustainable Communities. On behalf of the Institute, I want to extend my appreciation to the Gund Institute for the Environment and the University of Vermont for hosting this event and for inviting me to open our conversation. The Institute has a long-standing relationship with the Gund Institute, and I'm glad to join in and help perpetuate that wonderful relationship. Before I jump into our topic, I would like to give a little background on the rich Vermont history of ISC's founding and contextualize our work. The Institute for Sustainable Communities is a US-based international organization focused on community-led and locally led climate change interventions and sustainability. Local to your community with a global reach, Vermont Governor Madeleine Kunin and her policy advisor, George Hamilton, founded ISC in 1991. For 16 years, ISC worked solely in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union on capacity building programs focused on environmental management, clean energy, economic development, and public health. Our work initiated with a presence in Eastern Europe and the post-Soviet Union bloc, and ISC continues to work at the intersection of those same pervasive issues affecting our planet today, and we work on a global scale. This year, I'm happy to say, ISC celebrates our 30th year anniversary. Since our founding, ISC has led more than 130 transformative community and locally driven sustainability projects in 31 countries. Countries where we're working now are the United States, China, India, and Bangladesh. Very recently, we introduced a new program in the Mekong region in the countries of Vietnam, Cambodia, and Thailand. We have offices in Montpelier, Vermont, Washington, D.C., New Delhi, Shanghai, and Beijing. Our mission is helping communities around the world address environmental, economic, and social impacts and building a healthy and peaceful future shaped and shared by all. We know from our work, and we know from the standpoint of providing complex technical assistance and support, that building racially and culturally diverse networks and building the capacity of communities, local government, nonprofits, and private sector companies, and addressing equity requires acknowledgement of the harms and disproportionate impacts affecting those hardest hit by climate change. And this building effort also requires respect for and inclusion of the voices and interests of those people harmed most. We've learned from our work shaping policy and place-based decisions that building trust is paramount, and trust and relationships are the predicate to constructive dialogue and to finding common ground that leads to equitable climate change solutions. ISC's goal is tackling the interlocking environmental, social, and economic roadblocks that impede a healthy, equitable, and sustainable world. We tackle the systemic inequalities, extractive capitalism, and the global reliance on fossil fuels, which benefit the few at a grave cost to all people, especially marginalized population groups, and at grave cost to workers, farmers, public health, and our environment. Our work is more urgent now due to the global COVID-19 pandemic, which exposes the glaring disparities such as race, gender, and income strata, and the discriminatory policies and structures that compound environmental and climate change impact, particularly in underserved and underrepresented communities. Climate change and disproportionate adverse social, health, and economic impacts threaten the planet and obstruct healthy communities and their sustainability and resiliency. We have a theory of change. We focus on strengthening community knowledge, skills, and engagement, providing access to decision makers and policymakers, working with cities, local and regional governments to strengthen governance structures, working with corporate brands and the private sector to increase energy efficiency and resource conservation, reducing greenhouse gases and pollution emissions, and diversifying the field of sustainability professionals. Our approach at ISC incorporates capacity building, technical assistance delivery, knowledge products, climate action planning, and peer learning and collaboration. Our experience shows that equitable climate solutions enable communities to bounce forward from difficult challenges to resiliency and prosperity. ISC is the unique bridge between equity, community and local leadership, high agenda setting, and on-the-ground implementation. Now, a little bit about our programs. Internationally, ISC has programs, as I mentioned, in China, India, Bangladesh, and the Mekong countries of Vietnam, Cambodia, and Thailand. In these countries, ISC works with the public, private, and community sectors, devising smart, equitable, low-carbon development strategies and plans. We help generate economic opportunities for marginalized groups, including women, migrants, and people living in slums. Our work in China is one exemplar. In over 600 cities there, we've reduced urban air pollution and carbon emissions. One of the stellar achievements of our work is dismantling gender barriers in the clean energy space. 58% of our technical assistance trainings in China were delivered by women. Women made up 55% of our training attendees and 47% of the attendees of our Train the Trainer workshops. All of this opens the door to future women trainers in the field and future women workers. The Mekong Program, as I mentioned, is our newest initiative in Asia. Through our Mekong Sustainable Manufacturing Alliance, ISC supports international corporate brands, factories, factory workers, and managers, and we do work with them to increase the competitiveness of small and medium-sized enterprises in Asia, while improving environmental performance and the well-being of workers and communities. There are millions of small and medium enterprises that employ hundreds of millions of people across Asia. Simply put, Asia is the world's factory. Small and medium enterprises generate significant air, water, and climate pollution impacts, frequently failing to safeguard the well-being of workers, including migrants and people who are disadvantaged by gender and ethnicity. We roll up our sleeves to help work on these issues. We design and deliver trainings that prioritize innovative environmental financing models, for example, clean technologies and energy efficiency, sound environmental management, and due attention to health and safety. Gender equity and inclusive decision-making are some of the fundamentals of crafting a sustainable future shaped and shared by all. Throughout our Asian geographies, ISC programs prioritize women's advancement through education and media campaigns that we hope and intend will change minds. We emphasize the role of women and gender equitable practices and policies, both of which result in enhanced competitiveness, sustainability, and triple bottom line performance. In India, we support thousands of rural households. It's among the proudest, I'm proudest among all the work that we do, of this work that we do with women cotton farmers. We support the launch of profitable, sustainable, women-led enterprises, providing training in gender roles, income parity, and equitable household decision-making. We are intentional about improving the societal status of women in India. Agriculturally, ISC trains communities in India, supporting their stewardship of water and other critical natural resources. And we support the adoption of sustainable practices that strengthen resilience against climate change shocks. Small farmers, especially women, navigate a host of problems. worsening climate disruption, high agricultural production costs, water scarcity, unreliable access to markets, income insecurity, and environmental degradation. Our work in India's manufacturing sector recently was featured as a case study in this Climate Works Foundation report, which asserts that a just and sustainable economic recovery requires climate solutions rooted in equity. I'll let you take a moment to read this quote. It's pretty dense. We are really proud to be featured by this prominent foundation and their acknowledgement of our work. Now let's take a quick look at ISC's work in the United States, of which I'm also very proud. In the United States, we focus on local and regional governments, as well as under-resourced urban community-based nonprofit organizations, and health professionals and institutions. We prioritize strengthening their technical and advocacy skills, amplifying their power, and strengthening their effective engagement with each other, and in developing and driving equitable climate change solutions. ISC's peer learning and training promotes leadership development, transformative policy change, resiliency planning, and community-driven resource allocation decisions. Our work is deeply rooted in the history and experiences of people living and working in environmentally challenged communities. With these programs, like our work in Asia, ISC is advancing research, best practices, equitable policy solutions, all of these at the intersection of equity, climate change, economics, and health. Our climate resilient and healthy neighborhoods best practices and policy approaches factor in racial equity and disproportionate environmental and natural disaster impacts. We collaborate with community groups, designing inclusive approaches and strategies that increase the leadership influence of the constituencies we serve and partner with, that increases their technical and organizational skills, and their ability to successfully engage with each other, with government, and with industry stakeholders. Our Southeast Florida Regional Climate Compact work is a great example of this. It's where we work with local government officials and regional government officials from Broward, Miami-Dade, Monroe, and Palm Beach counties. And we're working with them on reducing their regional greenhouse gas emissions and implementing adaptation strategies while building climate resilience. So now let's talk about equity. And to talk about equity, first, we must very bravely talk about race. I've learned that people face things more bravely when they have data, facts, and information. So let's take some time to dig in. National data on the social, environmental, and physical determinants of health show that race underlies the environmental, social, and economic inequities that cause people of color and other marginalized communities grievous harm. Over the past year, Black Lives Matter, the international racial and social justice protests worldwide, and the COVID-19 pandemic blew the lid off race, justice, and equity seemingly everywhere. COVID-19 is our latest wake-up call that lays bare the social and global inequities, the environmental, economic, and social root causes of the issues and impacts that hit marginalized people the hardest, especially people of color, people who have low incomes, and people experiencing poverty. In the US, American Indians and Alaska Natives are dying of COVID-19 at nearly 2.5 times the rate of white Americans. Latinos are 2.3 times more likely to die from COVID-19. For African Americans, the death rate is nearly twice as high as white Americans. Asian Americans die from COVID-19 at the same rate as white Americans. The higher rates of infection and deaths is attributable to a range of factors that affect community health, community prosperity, and resiliency. A recent Harvard study tells us that environmental hazards compound other social determinants of health and quality of life. Air pollution, for example, is a leading problem. Disproportionate exposures to environmental hazards, air pollution, and other ecological toxins, and the lack of access to quality health care are a few of the stresses caused by racial and economic inequalities that lead to disproportionate effects on, for example, African American communities and other communities of color and low-income communities. Then there's the climate change, which in sum is a threat multiplier. Weather-related effects like heat waves, floods, fires, and hurricanes, when and where they hit, people of color are hit the hardest. Rooting out causes and effects related to race is the on-ramp to equity, setting up protections against other prejudice and bigotry, like sexism, heterosexism, and ableism. The United States Civil Rights Movement exemplifies the drive for racial justice, paving the way for improvements for many vulnerable groups, including women, LGBTQ folks, and immigrants. In the wake of the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, Rayshard Brooks, Dante Wright, Adam Toledo, and so many others, we've seen racial equity statements from the media, corporations and business, local governments and academia, environmental organizations, and many others. And these statements are welcome, but statements are merely a starting point. Action is our key to achieving equity. Action is the key to change. In short, equity is a critical platform for systems change and inclusion. Equity harnesses diverse resources and forces in ways that are beneficial for disadvantaged people and groups, and ultimately beneficial for everyone and beneficial for the planet. Inclusion creates organizational value by corralling the richness of different experiences, backgrounds, and perspectives. These synergistic principles are indispensable to valuing all of us and to the goal of ensuring that everyone shares in the benefits of social, economic, and environmental resiliency and prosperity. Supporting and encouraging the inclusion of racially and culturally diverse viewpoints and voices will help chip away at the panoply of interlinked challenges that inhibit equity for marginalized communities and inhibit everyone from sharing in the beneficial outcomes of the right decisions and the right actions. Creating opportunities for dialogue and learning and trust building and relationships is fundamental. Furthermore, inclusion and dialogue may take more than conventional governmental public participation strategies. Attention paid to race, gender, culture, and income strata is critical to ensuring that those who are hardest hit by inequities can access opportunities, participate in policy decisions that affect their lives and livelihoods, and benefit from investments and beneficial outcomes. The solutions that prioritize benefits for people who are marginalized will assuredly benefit everyone. I want to pause for a moment to say that the experiences of Black people, particularly African Americans in this country, are central to this discussion because overwhelmingly, African Americans are singled out and targeted for assault and incarceration, or blocked from access and opportunity. Black Americans are incarcerated at more than 5 times the rate of white Americans, and the blockages to economic participation happen in every area of life. That said, when disasters strike, people of color, people with low incomes and low wealth, because of social and economic factors, they are typically hurt the worst and are the slowest to recover. Racialized wealth gaps reduce the options people have, and they exacerbate the negative impacts of disasters. Let's look a little more closely at this US racial wealth gap. Statistics show that at $171,000, the net worth of a typical white family is nearly 10 times greater than that of a Black family at $17,150. Gaps in wealth between Black and white households reveal the effects of accumulated inequality and discrimination, accumulated barriers to sharing in good outcomes. Gaps in wealth also show the differences in power and opportunity that can be traced back to before this nation's inception. The Black-white wealth gap reflects a society fissured by inequities, and there are stark gaps in brown household wealth as well. What this means is, in terms of resiliency and disaster response, in terms of climate change, overall, whites have much more ability to bounce back than Black and brown people. Taking this wealth gap data into account, disasters, natural disasters, tend to devastate along the lines of existing inequalities. This puts achieving equity at the center of every emergency response and climate change policy, every stakeholder dialogue, every investment, and every solution. Equitable climate change solutions and equitable emergency response to natural disasters caused by climate change ameliorates the disparate protection from disasters that is caused by differential treatment, exclusion, and discrimination. There's urgency for people's lives in this conversation because alongside climate change, disasters are on the increase in frequency, severity, and cost. It's urgent for survival that we get ahead of the brunt of impacts that frontline communities will continue to bear. This slide is a snapshot of the catastrophic losses caused by natural disasters in 2020. As you can see, totaling upwards of $74 billion. A new study reported in the Journal of Social Problems examined the period of 1999 to 2013 and found that in counties with at least $10 billion in damages from natural disasters, comparatively, whites gained an average of $126,000 in wealth per household following recovery efforts. In comparison, the wealth of Black and brown folks decreased between $10,000 and $29,000. I'll share a few disaster examples that might be familiar to some of us in this group today. More than 30% of Black New Orleans didn't own cars when Hurricane Katrina hit, making it also almost impossible for them to evacuate. In Harris County, Texas, after Hurricane Rita, the increase in the disaster-related wealth gap between white households and Black households was $87,000. Hurricane Harvey dumped 27 trillion gallons of rain on Texas and Louisiana. Afterwards, in the following months, Black and brown people were twice as likely as their white counterparts to report experiencing an income shock following the storm, and then not getting help they needed from federal, state, and local government to recover. In contrast, white residents were twice as likely as Black residents to report, for example, that the Federal Emergency Management Administration had already approved their applications for relief. 3 years removed, and we hear this from communities that we work with in Texas, many residents of color still wait to be approved. Other coasts are no exception. After Hurricane Andrew, which struck Florida and Louisiana, African Americans and Latinos were more likely than whites to receive inadequate settlement amounts if they received anything at all. Stories abound among people of color and people with low incomes after Superstorm Sandy slammed into New York and New Jersey. Largely, once again, recovery efforts favored white homeowners and disfavored recovery for people of color. This time, in this case, people whose homes were rented. For people of color and low-income groups, the bottom line is the adage, get up and go, after a disaster isn't quite so simple. Logically, then, problem solving should put racial equity and equity writ large front and center. For federal relief responses specifically, equity means emergency management for everyone, resiliency for all, equity front and center. We need to ensure that we're collaborating with people who are underrepresented in climate change and disaster response, design, and implementation. We need to ensure that the systems and protocols established to address disasters fully take in language and culture differences and circumstances of those hardest hit into account, that we're connecting with and including and working side by side with community and local leaders, shaping adequate response mechanisms that meet the deepest needs. I like the NAACP Environment and Climate Justice Program's definition of emergency management, incorporating fair and equitable treatment for all. The definition integrates these 4 phases. Equity-based emergency management solutions rooted in addressing pre-existing inequities and differential or discriminatory treatment will result in better outcomes for everyone, including those hardest hit. Equitable emergency management values all communities and neighborhoods in the implementation of risk prevention, mitigation, and response measures. Constructive relationships between communities and the institutions of government make the inclusion and engagement of everyone in the climate conversation, the dialogue, much more than merely desirable. It's imperative. This is where ISC's work is important and urgent right now, because we prioritize tackling the interrelated and overlapping issues, again, facing people who are hardest hit. We prioritize places and areas where people are disproportionately affected by climate change, places where people are less likely to have the assets critical to recovery from the effects of climate change. It's important to know that race correlates even more significantly than income regarding who is hardest hit. The data is clear. Therefore, grappling with racial equity and leveling the playing field, so to speak, is absolutely central to successfully tackling disproportionate environmental and climate change impacts. With our philanthropic partners in the United States, ISC is working in 19 states with 39 community-based organizations, 31 of which are led by people of color. Because racial equity is a huge barrier to community health and resiliency, we focus on achieving racial equity using our national network for peer learning, technical assistance, and capacity building models. Our strategies support communities in building and strengthening their knowledge, influence, and their public policy muscles. Equally important, we pay attention to organizational development and strengthening community-based organizations by working with community leaders and their staff to increase organizational development skills and grow their organizations, their staffing, and their budgets. Our Upper Texas Gulf Coast Regional Resilience Initiative is another great example of ISC's work. Try to say that fast. Upper Texas Gulf Coast Regional Resilience Initiative. I just did. This program is a partnership with the Coalition for Environment, Equity, and Resilience, which is a group of over 20 member organizations, and Texas Southern University, which is an historically Black university. We work together to devise and advance climate change policy solutions and green post-COVID-19 recovery investments. This program supports local leaders through knowledge exchange and by lifting up the voices and real-life experiences of residents who've lived through hurricanes like Harvey and more frequent major flood and storm events. We use, for example, focus group sessions to hone in on the impacts that are affecting people, the impacts of hurricanes and floods. We hear from and learn from residents to understand their needs, mainly residents of color in this project. We listen to them about what's happening with disaster relief, about their applications for federal disaster assistance being denied, usually over small technicalities. We lift up these communities, their stories, and their experiences, and we deliver access to elected officials and governmental officials that are important decision makers in this realm. We engaged in this project, we engaged Texas Legal Aid, the Lone Star Legal Aid, it's called, to help residents obtain their property titles, for example, so that they can be eligible to receive federal assistance. It seems like a small thing, but sometimes the small things make the biggest difference. Emergency management service providers are now working with county governments under our auspices to streamline the processes through which community residents apply for recovery resources. We haven't solved every problem in the Upper Texas Gulf Coast region, but now governmental officials are responding more quickly and moving to provide applicants with more direct assistance. We're making progress. Our racially and culturally diverse community partners and the institutions that are important to their climate change resiliency are much more aligned around a policy agenda that pinpoints up front and clearly the inequitable distribution of resources and assistance and the impact of those differentials on the people. ISC's Partnership for Resilient Communities program is another example of our community building work. In this initiative, we drill down on transforming the urban climate resilience field by increasing the numbers of leaders of color in the field and by advancing approaches, working with them, that strengthen resiliency. We focus on people and places. We focus on building community influence and strength. We facilitate locally led and community-led policy approaches like workforce development and community education and engagement, solar energy installation, and green infrastructure are some examples. Let's take a look for a moment at green infrastructure in New Orleans. One of our community-based nonprofit partners in New Orleans is a group called Healthy Community Services, and they have a terrific story. They're taking green infrastructure to the historic 7th Ward there, which is one of the neighborhoods that was nearly obliterated by Hurricane Katrina. 2 decades later, this community is still working to rebuild. With support from ISC, Healthy Community Services is scaling their neighborhood flood prevention program. They've taken flood prevention into their own hands. Now they have 60 active green infrastructure projects in 3 neighborhoods managed by almost 100 local champions. Green infrastructure in the 7th Ward helped considerably during Hurricane Barry in 2019, when much of New Orleans was flooded again. Areas protected by this community group's bioswale interventions spared many of the neighborhood's homes, cars, and businesses from massive flooding, diverting hundreds of thousands of gallons of water. Let's talk a little bit about the promise of the Biden-Harris administration, which we truly believe in and are committed to. Now is the time for action. And we see, as I mentioned, great opportunity and promise with the new president and vice president. And we see great promise both domestically and internationally. From ISC's perspective, to be effective, the administration's approach must be integrated and inclusive of climate solutions that address the interlocking economic, social, and environmental roadblocks that people experience, particularly, as I've said, those compounded by the COVID-19 pandemic, which has basically ripped the cover off of a host of cross-cutting inequalities. An equitable green transition should prioritize the communities most negatively affected by the pandemic and grow an inclusive economy, which is America's best strategy to ensure health, well-being, and economic vibrancy for all. Furthermore, it's the moral and the right thing to do. Capacity building and technical assistance resources like those that ISC delivers are needed to help local governments develop equitable and inclusive regional stimulus programs and resource dissemination approaches, including robust community outreach and engagement, collecting and using data-informed decision-making processes, and inclusive governance practices. Small businesses and nonprofits need resources that support their effective advocacy for stimulus resources and assistance completing applications for those dollars, much like the disaster relief support provided by our Upper Texas Gulf Coast Regional Resilience Initiative. ISC is urging the administration to facilitate the development of a skilled workforce capable of meeting the demands of a new green labor market and ensuring the just transition for workers into environmentally friendly jobs and high-paying jobs and union jobs. We encourage the new administration to support the inclusion and engagement of advocacy groups that are educating and informing and partnering with federal, state, and local elected officials, governmental officials, and policymakers who are developing decision-making structures and policy approaches, which are intended to alleviate pre- and post-pandemic economic, social, environmental, and health inequalities. We're enthusiastic about working with the Biden-Harris administration. We have the experience, skills, relationships, and networks that support realizing real and equitable solutions. Let's not forget the significance of trust building, respect, sharing values, and reaching common ground. Efforts to work together take time and persistence. As students, if you're thinking about engaging in community building and agenda setting, if you're thinking about engaging in multi-stakeholder environmental dialogue and moving consensus processes, I recommend cultivating flexibility. In closing my prepared remarks today, I'll share a few of what I call my B's. Be an investor in relationship building. Be clear in your purpose to collaborate and partner. Be respectful of racially and culturally diverse leadership and differing views. Be open to learning from other people's lived experiences. Be honest, listen, and be willing to make meaningful adjustments as you learn. I appreciate the opportunity to be here with you today and share my thoughts about equity. I'm looking forward to our discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Deeohn, for a robust talk sharing about the ISC's crucial transformational work around the world, and also for sharing your wise bees. A gentle reminder to everyone to add your questions into the Q&A box. I'm going to start off with a question. Given this week, it's a big week in our nation's judicial system, Tuesday's court decision in the guilty conviction of Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin for the murder of George Floyd. And I'm curious what your perspective is on Minnesota Attorney General Keith Ellison's statement that this is a first step in accountability, but not true justice, because justice implies restoration. And then the words I've recently heard on Democracy Now! From Professor and historian Khalil Gibran Muhammad saying that the institution of police needs to be really on trial in order to create justice in this country, and how this relates to environmental justice.
Well, I completely agree with both statements. The verdicts in the Derek Chauvin trial, I think, are a beginning and the opening of a door to addressing centuries of discrimination and inequalities facing Black and Brown people in this country. It is past time for us to come to common purpose about and resolve about changing police practices that target Black and Brown people disproportionately. It's time for us to address disproportionate incarceration of Black and Brown people. It's time for us to tackle and redouble our efforts to tackle addressing a criminal justice system that is pernicious. And in terms of the relationship to environmental justice, as I mentioned in my talk, this is the criminal justice system is one of a confluence of situations that have to be factored in and considered because of the effects of what is happening with the climate justice system are compounded or compound what is happening with our environmental decision-making and with climate change impacts.
Thank you. So I don't at the moment see questions in the Q&A, though I imagine they will be coming in. So feel free to put them in the box. Folks, there are many people, at least 30 currently attending. And I guess while we're waiting, I'll ask another question that's pertinent to the Gund Institute. So the Gund Institute for the Environment, as I know you're well aware of, has really working towards increasing its capacity to support equity. And there have been recent conversations about its ability to examine environmental racism and dismantle it through, and there's actually a new Gund Diversity Committee proposing a research theme on environmental justice and equity in our shared commitment to improve diversity, equity, inclusion in the Gund, both within our research and the community and through. So students have been, and fellows have been given the opportunity to sort of offer ideas to the Gund of what the Institute can do to increase its capacity. And I was curious if you have advice or guidance for that initiative.
Well, I think my advice and guidance would be pretty basic. There are a lot of smart people at the Gund Institute who should be involved in these conversations. That would be obviously that's already happening. And I would say make sure that you are connecting and talking to people through whose lived experiences can contribute to your thinking about this. Make sure that you've got racially and culturally diverse folks involved in the conversation. Make sure that women are involved in the conversation. Make sure that other marginalized groups, folks with disabilities, folks, LGBTQ populations, make sure that you have a representative group of people who are prepared and are able to contribute from their perspectives, their vantage points, and their lived experiences to the conversation. Make sure the conversation isn't in a vacuum. Make sure that you're not only talking to each other, and be open to the inclusion of folks that maybe you hadn't considered should be included. Look around the table, observe who might be missing, identify that, and then find those folks who are missing and bring them if you can. And hopefully you will be able to into the conversation. We need to hear from everyone who's affected and involve and include and engage them in decision-making, in conversations on the way to developing decisions and consensus around issues. So my strongest recommendation would be to set the table in ways that ensure that you have representation across the board from as many groups that are affected by the subject matter that you're involved in and the subject matter that you're discussing. I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, that's really valuable advice. So a question came in asking about how did the ISC become involved with communities in Asia, the factory of the world? This person was saying that it's a long way from the American communities.
Well, actually, our US program is our youngest program at roughly around 4 years old. ISC targets places with the largest proportion of greenhouse gas emissions and actors that we can help make changes with that will result in measurable reductions in greenhouse gas and pollution emissions. China's a big greenhouse gas emitter. India is a pretty big greenhouse gas emitter. With the factory work that's going on in the Mekong region, we can also kind of hang that label on the Mekong region. So we target areas and countries and places where greenhouse gases and pollution emissions are pretty enormous. And that's how we dig into the work. So I hope that helps with that understanding.
Yeah, so there's gratitude in the chats for your talk and statements about how powerful the ISC is. And someone was asking, can you speak to the kinds of research questions, answers that would aid you and your colleagues in advancing equity and resilience aims?
Oh my goodness. I don't know that I can pinpoint anything specific at this moment, but I can say that I want to communicate to the group that research is as important on what we traditionally refer to as the technical side of environmental work. Research and data and science is just as robust on the equity side of the equation. And so as we're looking at designing and devising solutions, we try to help people understand that the technocracy of climate change, and we're building a bridge between the technocracy of climate change and sustainability solutions and the science, data, and best practices of equity. So I would say about research that research is important and data is important, both with regard to greenhouse gas emissions and pollution emissions and reducing those depredations, as much as research is important to identify, collect, and use in terms of applying an equity lens and developing solutions.
Okay, that's helpful. So another question, more gratitude and admiring the work of ISC is asking about how does your organization balance working at smaller scales like the community local level with larger scales working across international and cultural boundaries?
Well, we are really focused on we are really much more focused on what's going on the ground, and building the capacity of actors on the ground. And scaling obviously is very, very important. And our focus is very much locally driven, very much community driven. And we're really interested in building that capacity so that then our constituencies and partners can work at the federal level, the state level, the federal level, and so forth. So we really do concentrate on working on the ground.
Okay, so another question about how does the ISC hire and train people to ensure that projects like climate smart, low carbon or resiliency projects are shaped, possibly led by the voices, priorities, and underserved communities?
Well, we hire a lot of experts, and we have a lot of experts on staff. And when we need a particular expertise that we don't have on staff, then we hire consultants to help consultants with various expertise to help with our work. So in some, we have a staff of ranging now somewhere in the range of 60, 70 folks who are all experts in particular fields. So we have a body of in-house expertise, and where we identify gaps, we need to fill in those gaps. Then we seek out, and we have a roster of excellent consultants around the world who can add value to the work that we do.
So more gratitude is coming in about your inspiring action and positive examples, and agreement that including diverse perspectives and voices at the table. There's a question about what your thoughts are on how to do this at the initial stage in predominantly white spaces like EVM to avoid tokenization.
Well, I think I would reflect on the comments I made about inclusion with regard to the Gund Institute's exploration of investing more deeply in this work. You've got to seek out folks who have lived experiences who can help contribute to your thinking. And I know that Vermont is a fairly white space. There are historical reasons for that we don't have time to explore at this moment, but let's just put a pin in that and say that's a fact. And I think that a way to surmount that challenge is to reach out across geographical borders. We're all getting really adept at Zoom. If we don't have people in our immediate community that we can bring in, let's reach out and develop some relationships across those geographic borders, do some webinars, do some online conversations with people who have the lived experience and can bring that representation to folks in Vermont that want to learn and grow from that experience. And I also want us to just pinpoint that this is a two-way street. Folks in Vermont have lived experiences to share in these conversations and experiences to bring to bear in solving problems. So it's not a one-way street. It's a dialogue, it's a process, it's a conversation. And it's about looking around the table to find out who's missing and finding ways to reach out and include those folks who are missing, to amplify the conversation and illuminate the conversation and help us move our thinking along in the right direction. It's a two-way street, or a multi-way street, maybe.
Yeah. So one final question, again, more gratitude for the presentation, especially how Black and Brown communities are at a disadvantage when it comes to natural disasters. Something as simple as not being able to evacuate due to not having a car can be so overly overlooked. So this food system scholar asking the question mentions that it reminds them of the importance of designing inclusive food systems, and wants to know what advice might you have for researchers to keep racial equity at the top of mind when working on transforming the food system.
Read the research, understand the problem, understand the challenges, understand where people are facing the challenges, and talk to people who are having problems in the food system, as well as folks that are designing and advancing solutions to problems related to the food system. And there are, again, lots of interlocking, overlapping social, environmental, health, and economic reasons why the food system doesn't work for everyone. It's important to understand those underpinnings. It's important to connect with folks who understand those underpinnings and are working inside the system to make the changes. And to recognize, again, that race is at the core of problematic food systems. Income correlates, there's no doubt about it. We've got to be careful that our folks with low wealth and low income, irrespective of race, are involved and included in these conversations. But understand that the core underpinning really begins with the discrimination that certain communities are experiencing, the exclusion that certain communities are experiencing, and the economic barriers that they are having to grapple with that also affect their accessibility to nutrition and nutritious foods.
Well, I'm sure we could continue this for a long time. We are coming to the end of our time. So on behalf of the Gun Institute, I want to thank you so much, Deeohn, for joining us today and sharing your wisdom, and for everyone who joined us online. We will have the video and podcast of today's talk available next week. Please join us again next Friday for our next Gun Exchange with Xavier Brown, founder of Soilful and co-founder of South Eats, whose talk utilizing the wisdom of nature, collective work to rebuild and heal communities in Washington, D.C. will be on April 30th. And with that, I wish everyone a wonderful day and enjoy the weekend, and thanks so much.
Thank you, Jess, for your wonderful hosting, and thank you, everyone. Really appreciate the opportunity.